Interested in learning about wine, but not sure where to start? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I'm your host, Haley Bowman, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a wine enthusiast turned wine educator and founder of the Seattle-based wine tasting business, Cork and Fizz. It is my goal to build your confidence in wine by making it approachable and lots of fun. You can expect to learn everything from how to describe your favorite wine to what to pair with dinner tonight, and so much more. Whether you're a casual wine sipper or a total cork dork like myself, this podcast is for you. So grab yourself a glass and let's dive in. One of the most common questions that I get is, what wine should I pair with dinner? And that's a totally fair question. Many of us just want to enjoy some wine with our meal. And I'm sure many of us have also experienced a not so great wine and food pairing, so we want to avoid that. With this in mind, I created a private tasting experience to truly teach you how to pair wine and food, and to explain why some of these things work and why other pairings don't. In today's podcast, I'm going to walk you through this experience that I created, down to everything except the actual tasting of wine and food. Though honestly, grab a couple glasses of wine and some food and you can try it along with me. You can also follow along with my wine and food pairing guide. You can download this 3-page PDF on my website at corkandfizz.com/wine and food guide. So the plan for today is we're going to go through the history of wine and food pairing. You know me, I love my history and I love asking why. So we're going to cover that. We'll talk about some wine basics and food basics just to get us started. And then I'm going to teach you my 2-step process for pairing wine. Yes, just 2 steps. It's very simple. And then we'll finish with some pairing guidelines. By the end of this podcast, my hope is that you feel confident choosing a bottle of wine to go with your meal tonight. And any night. All right, as always, we got to start with a little bit of history. So before we get to the how of wine pairing, I feel like we should talk about the why. Why do we care about pairing wine with food? Out of all alcoholic beverages, wine is unique in that there's such a focus on pairing it with food. It's the most common alcoholic drink that you would have with a meal. So the thing is, when you think about it historically, centuries ago, wine was safer to drink than the local water supply. Remember when we were talking about rosé and how the first rosés were actually made by mixing wine with water? That's because everybody needed to hydrate with the water, but it wasn't super safe to drink, so they drank the wine with it. Of course, now our water is much safer to drink, and instead we pair wine and food to enhance the dining experience. So now that we know the idea is to enhance our dining experience, how exactly does it do that? Well, there are 2 options. First, your goal would be to have all components balance each other out for a perfectly cohesive meal. Basically, think of it like a duet or a group number. This is the most common technique that people use and their goal when they're pairing the wine and food. However, there is a second option. Let's say you're making a really fancy dinner, right? You've cooked up this really amazing meal, top-notch ingredients, you really went the extra mile, and you want a wine that will work well with the food, but not steal the spotlight. Or it could be the other way around. You've got a special bottle of wine and you want some food to enjoy with it, but you want the wine to stand out. When I think about this style of wine and food pairing, I essentially compare it to like a solo act with backup singers, right? They still work well together, but you're hearing, right, or you're tasting one thing a little bit more than the others, but they're there as support. Make sense? All right, it's time to get into the basics of wine and what we need to know if we're going to be talking about pairing wine with food. The 3 aspects are body, acidity, and tannin. So we're talking about the body of the wine. The body of the wine is the apparent weight of the wine in your mouth. A wine can be light, medium, or full-bodied, or somewhere in between. And for me, it's easiest to tell the difference between these 3 different bodies by comparing each level to a type of milk. All right, stick with me here. I know it's weird. So we're going to compare. Our light-bodied wine is essentially like a skim milk. It's very pale, it's very light, it just doesn't have a lot of weight to it, it's almost watery. Then you go to a 2%. This has a little bit more weight, right? That's your medium-bodied wine. It's got a little bit more to it, but it's still not completely there. And then you have whole milk, which is like our full-bodied wine, right? The whole milk is viscous, it coats your mouth. It's really got a lot of texture and just heaviness to it. So that's your full-bodied. Now, I live in Seattle and I've done plenty of tastings talking about this. And I've found that I'm not the only one out there that is lactose intolerant. So I came up with the Seattle-based version, which is so light, medium, or full-bodied, which compares to like almond milk is very light-bodied. Oat milk's got a little more weight to it. And then finally, like your full-fat coconut milk in a can is going to just have like a good amount of like weight and richness to it. So just in case it's been some time since you've had regular milk, hopefully that still gives you a good idea on the perspective of body. So you'll see a list of examples of each category on my wine and food pairing guide when it comes to this light, medium, or full. But keep in mind, every wine is going to be different. This is just kind of like the general guideline. So for example, Sauvignon Blanc tends to be in the lighter bodied category. It usually doesn't have too much weight to it. It's very just light and fresh and zippy. Versus like, let's say a Cabernet Sauvignon is usually heavier. It's got the tannin. It coats your mouth. That would be like a full-bodied wine. Now, body is important when discussing wine and food pairing because it's the starting point. And we'll discuss this later, but when you're pairing food and wine, you always want to match the body of the wine with the intensity of the food. This ensures that neither component overpowers the other. And this is also the main reason why you don't see like a full-bodied red wine like, say, Cabernet paired with sushi. The wine will overpower any of that delicate flavor the sushi tries to put forth. You also aren't going to see a light-bodied white wine with a thick grilled burger with all the fixings, right? Again, the burger in this case is going to overwhelm the wine. Now, this doesn't mean you can't pair red wine with fish and white wine with meat. You just have to take into account the body and the intensity of the flavors of the food. Okay, next component in wine we're going to talk about is acidity. And this one's quite straightforward. So acidity is described as the fresh, tart, and sour attributes of the wine. Essentially, how much does it make you pucker up like you sucked on a lemon? And one of my favorite ways for testing acidity in wine is called the saliva test. Now, if you listen to my episode all about how to taste wine, you will be familiar with this. It's also called the drool test. So this is where you take a sip of wine and after you swallow, you tip your head forward, but make sure your mouth is shut. Because what we're testing for is if you would have drooled all over the table after having a sip of that wine, that would be a high acidic wine versus something where you're not producing as much saliva. That's your lower acidity wine. When it comes to acidity, again, on that sheet, I should have some examples on the food and wine pairing guide. But just to give you an example, again, kind of going back, that Sauvignon Blanc, high acidity. Also, like Albarino is another one it's just got this very tart zippiness to it versus a lower acidity wine. If I stayed in the white wine category, I would say like a Roussanne or a Viognier. These have lower levels of acidity, so it doesn't have quite that like zippy freshness to it. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about when it comes to wine is going to be tannin. Tannin is what causes a tactile drying sensation, and it's a sense of bitterness after you've had a sip of wine. Tannin can also be found in black tea. So if you're a tea drinker and have ever left a tea steeping for too long, you'll know what tannin feels like. I relate it to having cotton balls in your mouth, which I have done on a dare at a sleepover, I think. I know I'm such a dork, but for some reason, I know exactly what that is. So you don't even have to worry about being like, oh, do you actually? Yes, I do. Weirdly enough, I do. So yes, the tannin is basically just, while acidity pulls saliva forward, I always like to say tannin kind of pulls it all back. It's like you're trying to like, that I hope you can hear that through the mic, but it's like you're trying to get some saliva back in your mouth. Now, note, mostly only red wines have noticeable tannin. And this is because that tannin comes primarily from the skins of the grapes. Now, when you're making wine and you're pressing the grapes, you produce a juice, and that juice is almost always clear, just like a white wine. So even with red grapes, and the way that you get the color on a red wine is that you put it in contact with the dark colors of the skins. Now, to be fair, tannin does come from the seeds, it comes from the stems, and it can also come from barrels if the wine's in contact with wood of any kind. However, the most noticeable and what you're actually going to be able to determine is going to come from the skins of the grapes. So primarily, tannin is going to be found in red wine. And when we're thinking about different red wines, for example, Pinot Noirs tend to have lower tannin levels versus something like a Cabernet Sauvignon, going right back to that one, is known for higher tannin levels. Okay, we've gone over the wine aspects. Now it's time for the food flavors. Whenever I lead a wine and food pairing experience, I always divide the shopping list into these categories. So we have bitter. This is things like walnuts, dark chocolate, especially the ones without any sugar, and green vegetables. Then you have sweet. Some examples here, some jam, some berries, sweet chocolate, so more like your milk chocolate. Then you have umami, and this would be something like a steak, a roasted mushroom, or even I've done like white rice with soy sauce on it. That soy sauce is what carries a lot of the umami flavor. Then you have salty. This is going to be the popcorn, potato chips. You get the idea. Next, we have acid or acidity. This is going to be a fresh tomato, pickled anything, or like a vinaigrette. Next, you have fat. Typically, what my mind goes to is prosciutto or cheese, but I always like to give a vegan option. So unsweetened peanut butter is also an example of this. And then you have spicy. So think hot sauce, right? Your Flamin' Hot Cheetos, spicy salami, all of that. So your 7 key flavor ingredients when you're talking about food are going to be bitter, sweet, umami, salty, acid, fat, and spicy. When we're figuring out a dish's key flavors, you can't just think about the main component though, right? So we can't just be like, my main dish is chicken with vegetables, right? So clearly the chicken falls maybe under the umami category. But you can't just look at that. Or maybe you're having some sort of pasta and it's a cheesy pasta. So, it must definitely be a fatty food. The thing is, the sauce of the dish could be more important than the meat or vegetables or main component used. A sauce can totally change the game and control the key flavors that shine in a dish. A great example I like to give for this is think about like a citrus salsa. So something like mango. I've had a lot of mango salsas, right? And they've got the mango. They've also got some habanero. They've got some spice, right? So it's got that citrusy acidity and the spiciness. And let's say we put that on roasted pork, right? That would totally change how you want to pair versus like if we had a roasted pork with a sweet balsamic sauce or a roasted pork with a rich buttery sauce, right? It's all roasted pork, but each time you change the sauce, it's going to change what the key flavor is in that dish. Another important aspect to keep in mind is cooking technique. There are some cooking techniques that really change the flavor of the ingredients. A great example is grilling. There are so many things that I taste so much better, that I think taste so much better on the grill. And that's because the grill gives it a charred umami flavor that might not be achieved through, let's say, broiling or steaming. If anybody's ever had a boiled chicken versus a roasted chicken, you'll know there's a major difference between those two things. Other cooking techniques that make a large impact on flavor include smoking, roasting, and searing. So now that we have the background knowledge out of the way, I want to share with you the 2 basic steps for pairing wine and food. So the first step we already discussed earlier. You want to match the body of the wine with the intensity of your food. Next, you want to determine the structure pairing. And what do I mean by this? I mean that you want to decide the key flavor aspect in the food. Is it primarily acidic, umami, salty? Again, keep in mind the components of the dish, but especially the sauce and how things were cooked. Do you ever find yourself standing in front of the wine aisle at the grocery store, feeling completely lost and overwhelmed? Don't worry, you're not alone. But what if I told you that I have a way to transform the wine aisle from overwhelming into an endless sea of joy and discovery? And it involves drinking wine and joining the most welcoming and fun community. In my Court Crew Virtual Tasting Club, we're all about exploring new and exciting wines in a fun and supportive community. No more feeling intimidated or stuck in a rut of buying the same bottle of wine. Each month, we explore 2 new wines so you can broaden your palate and explore new flavors. Not only will we taste these wines together, but we'll learn about where the wines come from, essentially traveling the world all through the wine in our glass. Come join the Court Crew and you'll have the opportunity to taste new wines, meet winemakers and other wine professionals, and connect with like-minded wine lovers from all over the world. Imagine the joy of discovering a new favorite wine and being able to confidently choose a bottle that you know you'll love. So, why not join us? Head to my website at corkandfizz.com/thecourtcrew to sign up. And don't forget to use code WINE101 to get your first month free. And now, back to the show. Now, during the rest of the podcast, I'll be sharing with you the recommended wine pairings for each style of food or each key flavor of food. So once you've figured out what is the key flavor, acidity, umami, salty, then you're going to use these techniques that I'm going to teach you right now, or these guidelines, I should say, that I'm going to teach you right now to figure out what type of wine you want to pair it with. And again, you can find all of these in my free downloadable wine and food pairing guide as well. It's linked in the show notes, and I mentioned it earlier, the website. But one thing I want you to keep in mind is that these are guidelines and not rules. All right. So just because I say you should pair this style of wine with that flavor of food doesn't mean that's the only option. And honestly, maybe it doesn't work for you, and that's okay. At this stage, your goal is to achieve a good mouthfeel between the wine and the food and to decide for yourself what pairs best. Whenever I host this experience as a private tasting, I always recommend people take notes as they try these. This tasting is an experiment, right? I'm not here to tell you exactly what you should be doing. I'm here to guide you along to try different things and figure out what you like. So keep that in mind, even if you're not trying wine and eating food along with me during this podcast, but just keep that in mind while I share these different tips. Now, before we get into the structural pairings, there is an optional step 3 when you're pairing food and wine. So step 1, match the body of the wine with the intensity of the food. Step 2, determine that structural pairing, which is deciding the key flavor of the food and matching it to a style of wine based on guidelines and your preference. Now, step 3 is to actually focus on the flavors in the wine and possibly pair them with a specific flavor in the food. This is often referred to as building a flavor bridge. This step is certainly optional, and it only works with some forms of food. So some examples here would be a butter sauce and an oaked Chardonnay. Well, an oaked Chardonnay that's gone through malolactic fermentation, essentially saying that the Chardonnay needs to have some of those buttery flavors to match with your butter sauce. You could also do ceviche and Sauvignon Blanc. Again, that ceviche has the same kind of citrus notes that a Sauvignon Blanc would have. Another example would be mushrooms and Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is known for having aromas of mushrooms and kind of earthy notes, which build that flavor bridge with the mushrooms. Now, learning the flavors in wines take time. But like I said, you can successfully pair wine without this step. So don't feel pressured to do it, but just keep it in the back of your mind whenever you notice something. All right, so a majority of this podcast is based on my wine and food pairing experience that I offer as a private tasting. At this point, for each guideline I discuss, you would be testing the guidelines, both the good and the bad, and determining what pairing you like best. So feel free to grab a glass of wine or two and some snacks and follow along. Or you're always welcome to book a private tasting with me. I offer them virtually or in person so you can get the full experience. Just keep in mind that if you are testing out a food and wine pairing, you should follow the process of first taking a sip of wine and thinking about it. Then take a bite of food, and either right after you swallow the food or just before, take another sip of wine. And now I want you to think about how the food changed the flavor of the wine. That's going to help you determine if for you it's a good or bad pairing. And you can always do it the other way around, where you have food first, think about the flavor of the food, try a sip of wine, and then go back to your food and figure out how did the wine change the flavor of the food. You might notice you like one direction more than the other. And while you can't always do that, it is fun to know. All right, without further ado, here are the guidelines for your structural pairings. Starting off, we're going to talk about acid and acid. So that means if you have an acidic food, you want to match it with equal or greater acidity in the wine. Essentially, a highly acidic food, anything that's, like a vinaigrette or like those fresh tomatoes or anything pickled, they can make your wine taste less fruity. So a good pairing, according to this guideline, would be an acidic food like a pickle or a salad with a vinaigrette paired with a highly acidic wine, like say a Sauvignon Blanc or a Brut Cava, like a sparkling wine. A bad pairing, if we're following this guideline, would be the same food. So thinking pickle, salad with vinaigrette, anything on that end, with a low acid white like Roussanne or a highly tannic low acid red like Merlot. And again, these are just guidelines, but if you have the opportunity, give these a try and see what you think. What is likely going to happen is if you try a highly acidic food with one of those low acid or high tannic wines, again, that food is going to make your wine taste less fruity. It's going to have almost like a metallic taste to it. And then with the good pairing, they should be able to kind of bounce off each other. Okay, so the first one, if you have an acidic food, match it with equal or greater acidity in the wine. All right, the next one is way easier. Salt is pretty easy to pair with. So salty food pairs with just about anything. The salt counteracts the mouth drying effect of tannins, so it doesn't seem quite as bitter. And then it also nullifies acid on the palate. So after you've had some acidic wine, you have some salt, you're ready to go in for another sip of that acidic wine. And if you're looking at my food and wine pairing guide, you'll see it also pairs well with sweet food because it enhances the sweet flavors. I mean, come on, who hasn't dipped their French fries in a milkshake before? If you haven't, you're missing out. Go try it. It's amazing. Or like salted caramel, right? Salt and sweet work together so well. This also makes sense why lots of wineries and bars tend to serve salted nuts, popcorn, or potato chips with their drinks, right? So yes, salt, very easy to pair with if you wanted to go super simple. Have a salty dish, pair it with just about anything. Okay, our next principle is similar to the acidic principle. When you have a sweet food, you want to pair it with a wine of equal or greater sweetness. So essentially sweet and sweet. Basically what happens, sweet food can make the wine taste less fruity, again like the acidity, and quite bitter. Or for me, wine tends to taste boring after I've had a bite of something sweet. This happens most frequently. Let's say if I'm out to eat and I ordered a glass of wine with my meal and I didn't finish the wine yet and I ordered some dessert. And if I take a bite of that dessert, I really never want to go back to the wine because it always just tastes like there's just nothing there. It loses a lot of its flavor. So when we're thinking about this, again, sweet and sweet. So a good pairing would be something like fresh fruit, jam, dessert, right, with a Moscato d'Asti. One of my favorite pairings is an angel food cake with strawberries and whipped cream. Pair it with Moscato d'Asti. It's amazing. Another example would be chocolate. So like our sweet chocolate with port wine. Now, port wine is rich. It has tannin, but it's also sweet because they stop the fermentation process. So they keep sugar in there. So that will work with the sweetness of your chocolate. Now, a bad pairing would be the same food with a dry, aka not sweet. Remember, dry is the opposite of sweet in the wine world. With a dry red like Nebbiolo or Cabernet Sauvignon. And again, what will happen is those wines will lose a lot of their fruit flavors. And so you're just left with what's left behind after that. And this guideline is why I'm always hesitant to pair chocolate with red wines. And again, specifically non-sweet red wines. So if it has some sweetness in it, definitely give it a go. Oftentimes the sugar in the chocolate can just make the wine taste bitter. But again, not gonna yuck your yum. If you love chocolate and Cabernet Sauvignon, you keep doing you. There's nothing wrong with that. These are just guidelines. Okay, next up, if you have fatty food, that pairs well with acidic or tannic wines, but for different reasons. An acidic wine will help cleanse your palate after fatty food. I feel like this makes a lot of sense when you think about having like a bite of cheese and how that cheese kind of coats your mouth. And then you take a sip of like a Chardonnay or a champagne, a sparkling wine, right? It just seems to kind of like freshen and liven everything up. On the other hand, fatty food will decrease the bitterness in tannic wines. More than fatty food, protein. So high protein foods do this too. This is why steak pairs so well with tannic wines. And there's actually science to explain this. So when you take a sip of wine, the tannins in the wine bind with your salivary proteins. This is why you experience that dry, grippy feeling. When you take a sip of wine after enjoying a piece of cheese, the tannins are now split between the salivary proteins and the fat in the cheese that's still in your mouth. Since there are not as many tannins available for the salivary proteins, right? We've split them now. They're only getting half of the amount that they did before you had the cheese. The wine now feels less astringent, less grippy, and smoother. So again, fatty foods or again, high protein foods pair well with acidic and tannic wines. Okay, the next one is going to be talking about spicy foods. Spice is always a tough pairing with any alcoholic drink because alcohol increases the burning sensation of spice. For most people, a contrasting pairing works best here. So you want to have a sweet wine that will contrast with and balance out the spicy sensation in food. However, this is a great example of where food pairing is also very cultural, and it can change based on where you are in the world. So most of us in America, especially those of us that grew up in the Midwest, would describe the burning sensation of chili oil as unpleasant. However, for many Asian cultures, that bitter burning sensation is a pleasant and sought-after experience. Thus, they might want to enhance that feeling with the wine. When I'm American, so, and you could even say Midwestern in this case, where we would aim to counteract it. So in this case, a good pairing to me and my palate would be if I was going to eat a Flaming Hot Cheeto, I'd want a glass of sweet Riesling next to me. I want to contrast that spice. I want to tame it, essentially. A bad pairing to me would be that same Flaming Hot Cheeto and a sip of Cabernet Sauvignon, because that tannin and that acidity is going to enhance, that alcohol is going to enhance the spiciness, and that is not what I want. But again, it depends on your palate, and that's why I always say these are simply guidelines. All right, so we've gone through 5 main structural pairings and guidelines. So we started with acidic food, pairs well with acidic wine. Salty food pairs well with just about anything. It likes acidic wine, it likes tannic wine, it likes sweet wine. Then we talked about sweet food, pairs best with sweet wine. Then we have fatty food, which pairs well with acidic or tannic wine. And finally, our spicy food pairs well with sweet wine, unless you really enjoy the burning sensation, in which case, go ahead and pair it with a tannic wine. Now, when it comes to our other 2 key flavors, umami and bitter, there aren't a lot of great guidelines out there right now. These 2 styles can be a bit harder to pair wine with, especially bitter. So my advice is just to try a whole bunch of stuff and see what works for you. And there you have it. You've learned the basics of wine and food pairing. You've learned 3 important aspects in wine: body, acidity, and tannin. You've learned the different flavors in food: bitter, sweet, umami, salty, acid, fat, and spicy. And most importantly, you've learned the simple 2-step process for pairing wine and food. First, you want to match the body of the wine with the intensity of the food. Then you're going to determine the structural pairing by figuring out the main flavor in the food and matching it to a style of wine. And remember, when matching the food to wine, the guidelines that I shared are just that, guidelines. You should test these out for yourself to learn what you prefer. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. If you loved it as much as I did, I would so appreciate it if you could take a quick second to rate it and leave a review. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We release new episodes every Wednesday. In next week's episode, I'll be interviewing a very talented winemaker who makes one of my favorite orange wines, Anna Clifford of Final Girl Wines. She's making delicious wine out of Santa Barbara, and I can't wait to chat with her. Thank you again for listening, and if you want to learn more about wine, come follow me at Cork and Fizz on Instagram. And to try more wines outside of your comfort zone, perhaps with a fun food pairing, be sure to sign up for my virtual tasting club, The Cork Crew. Along with our virtual tastings, I also like to add in fun little workshops here and there that are included in your membership, and we've even done a food and wine pairing one before. You can use code WINE101 to get your first month absolutely free. Cheers!